and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. It's the 1st of May, May Day, or International Workers' Day, a day to celebrate the gains of the labour movement internationally, and for us to draw the lessons and continue to build the fight for the working class. So today, we want to have a discussion on working class struggles, particularly as they relate to the organised labour movement or in the trade unions. What should be the approach of communists and trade union militants within the union movement? What are the challenges, the risks, especially in today's climate where the left, yes, we will say it again, finds itself isolated and divorced from huge layers of the working class? So today, as the left celebrates, and as do we, it's all the more important to pay attention to the burning question of what to actually do to improve the conditions of the working class and advance its historic interests. So to discuss all of this, I am joined today by Comrade Perrault. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
Hello. So we were discussing this right before we started recording about why I decided to ask you to come on this episode. You're not a worker. You're not in a union.
No.
But initially I asked you because the very simple reason that you wrote a short article in the last Spartacist, which I really like. I think is really important. Go check it out. It reads like a guide for union militants and the left. And it's called For Revolutionary Work in the Trade Unions. So you wrote it. So for me, it was as simple as that. You wrote it. Let's get you to talk about it. That was the reason. But in talking to you, you want to add your own elaboration for this. You want to justify your own presence on this episode about working class struggles. So why don't you open with that?
Yeah. When you first asked me, I was a bit ambivalent because I was like, I'm not, in any trade union. And really, you can't replace that on-the-ground knowledge about how you're actually conducting the work on a daily basis, what workers are saying. And obviously, I can't, that's not really where I can help. But what I accepted to talk about it is because there's also another side to trade union work from a communist point of view, and that's the role of the party in trade union work. Mm-hmm. And so that side of the work is a bit more behind the curtains. You won't, and it's not like obvious on the face of it, how does a party play a crucial role in trade union work? And that is somewhere where I do have some experience is in being the party side of some of the trade union work.
I think that's important. And I want to keep that thread of the party and the trade union together. I want that thread throughout our discussion, if that's possible. Do you want to explain a little bit more to our listeners what that really looks like? Because I don't think it's self-evident just by saying, "Oh, well, there's a relationship." Like, no. What do you mean?
It's really crucial, actually, because to start with, the importance of having people in the trade unions, and that's something that's really minimized in most of the left today, or anybody's kind of seen as workers, or soon to be workers. But it's really crucial to have comrades that do work actively in the trade unions and in the working class in general for the party to really orient itself. Like without that connection, the party is basically blind to the realities of what's really happening on the ground in the class. It's forced to keep its interventions at a very general level. Correct. And really divorced from what's actually going on. And so the party, so that's one side of it. On the other side of it is that, being in a situation of trade union work, there's very intense pressures and the work is so specific. Like you're really direct, you're like facing very specific, very concrete conditions that sometimes it's not natural to be able to generalize your experience in terms of a national or in an international point of view, to be able to make that connection between what you're facing on the job today and the general strategy and international perspective. So it's really like this kind of two-sided relationship that's really crucial for any revolutionary party. And a healthy revolutionary party is one where you'll really have a real exchange between trade union comrades, party leadership, and so on. So you don't just have the party leadership that's dictating, instructions to comrades in the trade unions that's totally divorced from the reality of the conditions they're facing. And it's now also the other side where, trade union comrades are just kind of doing work in a economist or just kind of limiting their work to the immediate short-term perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot in what you said, which, you can go off into multiple different directions in the terms of this discussion. But I think there's just a few things jumping off the top of my head. Reminds me of What Is to Be Done, Lenin.
Yeah.
The role of the party, the vanguard, is to bring the consciousness into the working class. That's one. The other, I think, and this is very much, I was struggling a little bit, like, what exactly do I want out of this conversation? Do I want this to be oriented to, like, the left, working class? But there's a huge overlap in terms of those people who will listen to this or who listen to the show will tend to be leftists, and some of them are in the working class and in the unions. But I think one thing that the left, being in its bubble, forgets is that for a majority of people, you don't have a choice but to go into, you don't have a choice but to be a worker. Like, that's just life. So there's a certain sense of, I don't know, dare I call it privilege in saying, oh, you got to go into the working class. Like, let's get real. People don't have a choice. You got to earn a living, But I think that's the thing, that this is life. People do this because this is life. And then when the leftists come into the unions, therefore, this is their intersection with the normal mass of the working people. So you got to try and use that position, that role, your presence within your coworkers to actually, win them over to some socialist ideas. Not, start teaching them about Marx or whatever, but you got to show them in the struggle of, like, why, one, it's important to be in the union, why, two, you can't just fight for things in in an alliance with your boss, so many things. So I think those are just some of the things jumping off of what you said that sprung to mind.
Yeah. But to start on the problems with the left, I think probably for most workers, it's very clear when they see the left that this is very distant from their social reality.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a foreign world. Because the left today in most countries is dominated by retirees and student age people, or and middle class professions. That's basically the composition, which is not at all historically the case. The communist movement was really built on the industrial working class, and there's a reason for that. Now, in many countries, the industrial working class is not what it used to be, but still, that orientation is still absolutely crucial.
Right. And that's one of the things we've been pushing about, why you actually need to go into the working class to get proletarianized in order to bridge that divide, that huge chasm that currently exists between the left and the mass of the working.
Now, in terms of approaching the trade union work, I think trade union work is in many ways some of the most difficult work to do properly as communists, because you really have to be extremely concrete. Like, you can't, like, if you're coming in with broad ideas, like general ideas, like we need communist revolution, we need the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Let's fight for a general strike.
And you start banging on about that, like, it will not work. And you'll find out very quickly that this will not work. You'll
actually, in fact, be isolated and be the weirdo.
Yeah.
In today's climate, maybe not, a century ago, but in today's climate, if I rocked up to my union meeting and started saying all this stuff, I would have nobody who finds me relevant. They might think I'm a bit funny or kooky or, okay, let's listen to what she has to say, over a pint. But they won't think that I'm relevant for instance, the next disciplinary meeting they have with the boss over, question X, Y, or Z, or the speed up that they're currently experiencing, or something like this.
So that's kind of the difficulty is you have to be concrete. You really have to, like, root your intervention in terms of what's really going on, in terms of what the consciousness of your coworkers really is. But then with doing that, with being so concrete, then there's the flip side. And that's actually the dominant pressure in trade union work is that of just going with the dominant mood that exists among a specific workforce. Exactly. Right. And specifically where that comes in is really conciliating the trade union bureaucracy.
Right.
So the difficulty is really to be very concrete but at the same time remain principled.
Right.
And in terms of what it means to be principled, because I think that's also like can be a big question. Like, what is like an intervention that will actually advance the class struggle, and what is an intervention that will not advance the class struggle? And finding that line is often what's really difficult.
It's concrete. It is concrete.
It's concrete.
Yeah, definitely. I hope to get to some of our work later on in the discussion to give examples, because I think one of the things we've been accused of is doing sub-reformist work. But I mean, from our point of view, our methodology, our approach is that, well, you have to look at where the situation is, where the consciousness of people is. So what exactly is the line that in a current given juncture in a given industry will be that thing that actually rips away some of the cobwebs in your coworker's consciousness that could be something super, super minimal, like don't cross a picket line, like it's just very concrete. So I appreciate you saying that. I do want to get some terminology clarified and out of the way, just for the benefit of some listeners who, maybe aren't super well versed in leftist talk. Okay. Trade unions, that's straightforward. But like, we talk about the trade union bureaucracy all the time. What is that? What is the nature of it? I would like to get that, clear. What is the trade union bureaucracy, and why are we always just complaining about it?
Well, I think to most workers, the trade union bureaucracy is pretty clear. It's the people that run the unions, and often, especially in countries like where there's like a very powerful trade union bureaucracy, like the United States, like especially if you start looking at the upper echelons of the trade union bureaucracy, like these are people whose conditions are very removed from those of workers, and many workers actually see them as basically like working hand in hand with the bosses. That's unfortunately increasingly common. But then it goes from there. It goes from the top levels, the top bureaucrats that make
so like
big
the general
salaries.
Secretaries who do get elected.
Yeah,
let's say they are technically elected.
Depends on the union.
Yes,
depends on
we'll get to all this. Yeah,
but then it goes down, and then you have, depending on where we're talking about, then you have lower levels who are much closer to the working class. Shop stewards and so on, you'll have a very big degree of consciousness at those levels, and a lot of people that will go in those lower rungs are people that really want to fight to improve the conditions of the working class.
So, okay, would it be correct to say that the trade union bureaucracy, is anybody who's working officially in some capacity for the union?
Maybe if I pose it this way, what's the difference between like a trade union bureaucracy and a union that would be run, and we would say, oh no, it's not a trade union bureaucracy here. That's actually a good union leadership. And the fundamental difference is really in terms of the policy which they follow. Like that's actually the fundamental difference. So is it a layer that's actually playing a role of a brake on the class struggle, that's holding back the class struggle, or is it a leadership that's actually pushing it forward? That's actually the fundamental difference.
Yes. I mean, and for us, yes. And in general, yes. I think part of that is if you are, if all of a sudden revolutionaries ran, say, I don't know, Unite here in Britain, or even, we took over the AFL-CIO in the US. That has very concrete implications. For example, you wouldn't get, hundreds of thousands of pounds as your salary. You would say no. Because I am part of my brothers and sisters in the class, I'm going to get a worker's wage. And it has concrete implications. It's about the politics, but from the politics flow real organizational implications.
The non-democratic nature of the unions, the kind of open corruption that happens, all of these things. But they all kind of come down to what is the actual policy you're following. Yeah. And if I can use that to go back to a bit of the earlier point I was making in terms of like where's the line more on like when you're in a trade union, and what's the line between doing an intervention that actually is a revolutionary intervention and one that's not a revolutionary intervention, because that's can be a very tricky line. If it were just a question of sounding radical, then that would be easy. If it's just to say I'm for revolution or for communism or for general strike, if that's what you needed to do to be a revolutionary in the trade union, that would be very easy.
Yeah.
You just check a box and that's it.
Yeah.
But that's not what makes you a revolutionary in a trade union. You can be 10 to 100 times more revolutionary in a trade union sometimes by making a very, very minimal intervention, but one that actually concretely pushes forward a course that will advance the class struggle against the bureaucracy that's trying to halt this intervention.
I have a couple of things to say on that. So by definition, if it wasn't clear, by definition, the bureaucracy is this layer that has a material interest in keeping things the way they are, and that part of it is their salaries, they get big fat paychecks. But the reason why they act as a brake on the class struggle is because of their material position. Right, that's one. I think the other thing is, and this also has to do with the period and the consciousness and so on, is that, okay, in some industries, in some cases, it might be very clear. Like the AFL-CIO has a long tradition where, leftist, more conscious workers call it the AFL-CIA. But I think it really depends on the union, the country, and so on and so forth. For example, I think in this country, it would be I'm pretty confident in saying that when you think of a general secretary of a trade union, there is a de facto sort of authority, like, oh, okay, Sharon Graham said this, or okay, whatever, I don't know, back in the day, Mick Lynch said this, or Daniel Kabede said this. Like, some people, I think, because of their inexperience, I'm thinking of certain industries where there is very little experience in the real class struggles. I think the fact that it's like, okay, you're the leader of this union, there is this idea of like, okay, well, you must be good. You got elected. You're in this position of authority. You get to negotiate with the government or the employer. So there is also a basis where that generates a lot of illusions and a lot of trust, like a de facto trust, and I think this has to do with, again, like the concretes of a given industry and so on and so forth. But yeah, what I experience.
Yeah, it's that's very real. What you're saying is that there's a I think often a sense among workers that like those are the powers that are there, that exist.
Not just powers that are there, but they've got my back.
Yeah, to a certain.
They've got my back. Because I think the thing with the bureaucracy, sorry, this is getting interesting. The thing with the bureaucracy is that they are, by definition, leaders of workers' organizations. They do have to talk and say things that appeal to workers so they can talk left. So then that's like, oh yeah, that guy, especially in the context of a strike, they're like, oh yeah, they're fighting for me. They're like blustering. They're saying things that are like, oh, we'll stand tough, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, At the same time, then there can also be very conciliatory to the forces that be. So I think it's just important to understand like that the trade union bureaucracy is this beast, which in the heads of like, I think, I was going to say the leftists left, but, really it's just the Sparts that were like, okay, well, they're this rotten layer. But you can have left-wing bureaucrats, you can have right-wing bureaucrats, and then that's also where a huge part of the challenge emerges.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you're touching on one of the key issues here is that there's kind of a two-sided nature to the trade union bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Like it's based on the working class. They are working class organizations. That's where they get most of their, well, in most cases, that's where they get their money and influence.
The dues
is from their influence in the working class.
Yeah.
In Russia, Tsarist secret services actually set up unions, but even those unions set up by the secret services ended up being at the forefront of the 1905 revolution and led by Father Gapon, because they had this organic link with the working class. So they were forced to they were pushed into action by their very nature. Mm-hmm. So that's why
because they're accountable.
I wouldn't say accountable, but they're connected. They're organically connected. Mm-hmm. So that's why you can have the worst gangsters running some of these unions sometimes. People that like have total contempt for the working class, but still in some situations be forced to take a militant and confrontational stance. Yeah. So this is what leads many people to view, and on the left, to see the trade union bureaucracy as this kind of neutral terrain.
Yeah.
That you can kind of push it
To
on the
the
side of the
left.
workers, or sometimes it will be on the side of the bosses.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of brings the job of leftists to just kind of pull the blanket on our side.
Yeah, a tug of war where the bureaucracy is this, you got bosses on the one side, you got the socialists, the left, whatever you want to call it, or the workers even on the other side, and they're going to do a tug of war and make the bureaucracy do their bidding.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I'm getting from you is that that's an incorrect understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You have to understand that basically, to put it a bit bluntly, you have to be a revolutionary to really advance the interest of the working class in a fundamental way.
Okay.
In capitalism. I know this is a very general point.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'm getting there.
But that is a true point, okay?
Okay.
Like that has to be kind of your starting point. I know it's a very general point, but it has to be your starting point. Your starting point has to be that if you want to really kind of advance the class struggle, you have to have a view of like the whole nature of the system, and an understanding of how workers get kind of crushed in every which way possible. You have to have this broad view and this broad understanding. And that's how you can actually move the struggles forward. Now, that's one side. But the other side is, if you want this to be actually effective, it has to be concrete.
Yeah.
It has to be really based on what's actually happening.
Okay.
So that's why, in some cases, most simple interventions, actually often the most simple interventions, are those that really put their finger on what's holding back the struggle. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like this grand demand, like a general strike, but pushing on exactly the buttons where the trade union bureaucracy doesn't want to go on.
Yeah.
And it's by pushing those buttons that you can actually move the struggle forward.
Move the struggle forward, yes. But what does that mean? It means that you are holding to fire the feet of those bureaucrats who are talking in given instances quite left or quite militant, strike, strike, strike. And then you say, okay, good, let's do it. Let's make this even better. Let's make this a strong, hard strike. And let's do it by doing X, Y, Z. And then that's where the rubber hits the road, because they will find 100 different reasons, including blaming their own members. Like, oh, they don't want to do this. Yeah. Well, it's like, no, including all of those things to throw up obstacles to strengthening that struggle. Yeah. And that's the point, that we have to be those forces that insert a wedge wherever we find those cracks in what the bureaucracy says it wants to do and how it concretely actually undermines what it wants to do.
And I think this is what's a bit tricky with our discussion is like we're speaking in very, very general terms, right? And what's difficult is that precisely trade union work is very, very concrete. So it's really to be able to make this bridge between the general principles, how do you approach it in general, and then the concrete application. Okay. And to build a bit on one of the points you made, like one of our most effective interventions that we've done in the last years was simply, there's this trade union bureaucrat, there's this struggle going on, and this leftist trade union bureaucrat, the main trade union bureaucracy is refusing to move the struggle forward. Yeah. They're actually hand in hand with the bosses attacking the working class. And this leftist bureaucrat, who's connected obviously to these top bureaucrats, makes this militant speech. We need to fight. We won't take this. Blah blah blah. And our comrades' interventions was simply to say, this was a good speech. Let's do it. And that drove that leftist bureaucrat insane. He was extremely angry at this. Yeah. Why? Because we were putting our finger right on the hypocrisy, on the difference between what he was saying to the workers and what he was actually doing. Yeah. So, but to be able to kind of really identify that point, which is, it came out we made a very simple point. Yes, good speech. Let's do it. But to be able to kind of understand that, you have to have a broader understanding of all these various kind of dynamics that are going on.
It's unfortunate that we can't go into more detail about that particular instance, because part of the thing is that you do have to be quite careful in terms of keeping, identities. Like there is you want to keep a wall. You want it to be difficult for the bosses to identify.
Well, I think one benefit from this discussion is that we can get into a bit of what goes on behind the scenes, because often in our trade union work, we're not like banging on, oh, this was an ICL intervention in this specific arena.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. But I mean, we have done. But look, for instance, there is a work of our comrades who are actively, employed in unions who do work on a day-to-day basis. And then there's our actual trade union intervention. So I think that allows us to have a certain distinction where we can talk about some interventions. I think some of the things that come to mind is, especially in the United States, Boeing recently, the UAW strikes a couple of years ago.
And more recently, we just did a really important intervention in the meatpackers strike in the United States.
Meatpackers, yeah. So we've done that. I think a lot of that is American and Britain. It was a strike wave. I think that was probably the most relevant example in our time here. So we do regularly talk about it. I think I had Jens on the show talking about IG Metall in Germany. So there's degrees to which we can talk about, but I think it would be useful to get a little bit concrete with some of the flesh on some of the bones to give some sense to young leftists who are conscious and who are like, look, I want to go into the working class, but I gotta have a clue of what to do.
I was not involved directly in this, but I think the meatpackers intervention was quite important recently. I think it would be good to maybe have somebody that was involved to come on the podcast. Yeah. But in terms of that intervention, it was very interesting for us because we're doing this intervention without having anybody there. Yeah. And so it's really but that same dynamic exists, which we discussed, between the working class and the party. Yeah. Like a lot of what we did there is to try to find out what was going on and to through our intervention learn from the workers we were talking to about what's the state of the industry, what are the conflicts, what are the different polarizations, and then to try to inform the propaganda and then deepen even more that relationship. But what was striking with that intervention, and actually a lot of the work we do, is that often we go to these picket lines and so on, and there's basically no leftists.
Yeah. I think that was true for so this was a meatpacker strike in Greeley, Colorado at a JBS plant, which is one of the largest, I guess, meat, whatever, companies in the United States. It's a Brazilian company. But quite strikingly, they had, I think, at least 56 different languages. Yeah. They consciously have this policy of bringing in, actively recruiting workers from some of the most oppressed countries in Latin America mostly, but I think other parts of the world as well, as a conscious way of keeping different segments of the workforce divided. So one of our points of intervention was just to have an elected rep from each of the different linguistic groups. French, there was Spanish, there was Creole, there was others, and just to have them just as a basis for communication. These are some of the most oppressed workers in a horrible industry. Out in the sticks in Colorado, super isolated. No leftists here. We were really well received. We wrote a series of leaflets on this question. Our American comrades did. I can link them in the show notes. But something as basic as that, because that actually facilitates the ability of the different segments of the workforce, because for God knows how they've been pitted against one another by the bosses, to at least communicate and get on the same page about what's the status, because the bureaucracy wasn't even communicating everything about the negotiations that was going on with them.
One of the basic points that comes out in different ways in our various interventions is really to try to push workers that are in struggle to understand that if they want their struggle to advance and to succeed, they need to basically take a leap and try to organize themselves and take control of their own struggles. Not this kind of, especially in this particular case of the meatpackers, it's like this bureaucracy that like lives on another planet that does not give 2 cents about like the what's actually going on. Really like totally treacherous. Yeah. So it's to really push this consciousness forward. Like you need to kind of take matters in your own hands. If you want this to succeed, you need to take control of your own strike. That's one of the kind of recurring themes.
Yeah, but I'd push back just a little bit. I mean, I know that's a theme, because we want to drive a wedge against the bureaucracy. But it's not just about taking matters into your own hands, but on a basis that actually can
win. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Yeah. So, I mean, that brings it back to the whole question of the party, the role of the communists, and the trade union, and what we're trying to do within that. I'm wondering if there's other examples we can use to flesh that relationship out a little bit more before we're getting into some of the concretes about, in your article, you've got nice little subheads about specific challenges and dangers of working within the trade unions.
Yeah. Well, I think this next example will actually do a bit of both. So I'd like to talk a bit about France, because that's one thing that's very interesting with trade union work is it's very different from one place to another. Sometimes even within the same country, it can be very different from one place to another. At the same time, it always comes back to the same basic rules. So a lot of the Anglophone world, like I'm thinking of, the US, Britain, but also many other countries, like the kind of status quo is very low, like level of struggle in the trade unions. And sometimes like even doing a militant strike for a couple of days is like out of the norm, or it has become that.
You'll see that happen at maybe specific workplaces. I think in Britain, the Birmingham strike's been going on for over a year.
Yeah, but with Thatcherism, you really had a new status quo imposed in the unions where the general level of militancy of any given strike is relatively low.
Yeah.
Right. And so often you look at places like the France, and that can look like workers are like semi-revolutionary over there.
Yeah.
You look at strikes in France and they have like these big strike movements, national strike movements. They go in demos, they have these flares. Like it looks really good and quite impressive.
Barricades, fire, burning things.
Well, yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah. That would sometimes the barricades usually are not what they used to be.
Yeah. But look, as somebody who's not super familiar with the French labor movement, but understands a little bit of it from working within the party, it certainly looks impressive.
Yeah.
And it looks like it bucks the trend of what's happening internationally. Like it looks like, okay, workers there, they've really figured it out. They're just consciously wanting to struggle all the time. That's the image you get.
And so with such low level of trade union militancy that's been established in the Anglophone world, there's really this danger of having these other examples like France, or even when you have a trade union bureaucrat that appears that suddenly speaks a little more left wing, like Sean Fain in the United States, then it throws everybody for a loop. Because if for years you think that just kind of going on a militant strike is like a level of militancy that cannot be attained by the trade union bureaucracy, and suddenly the trade union bureaucracy turns around and declares, a strike for all the auto at the same time, then it looks like suddenly what's the point of being a revolutionary? Suddenly the bureaucracy is kind of like overtaking you on the left, and that's caught out a lot of left groups. So that's why it's important to look at cases like France. And so although France looks very militant on the face of it, there you have a different kind of disease in terms of leftists in the trade unions. It's just to kind of the French bourgeoisie has really succeeded in basically segmenting the working class, and launching it into struggle. So basically the trade unions, they go into struggle like not as one big block, but like in small components, like one at a time. And so within that, you can have very, very militant workers that will like go on strike indefinitely for sometimes weeks and weeks, but they're totally isolated from the rest of the movement. Generally in the United States, North America, and Canada, when there's a strike, basically all unionized workers go on strike. And that has a very strong power right from the get-go. But in France, you have different unions, and you get this in Britain too, different unions calling strikes at different times. And so you have really a segmentation of the working class. And there, the danger you really get is ultra-leftism here. So you'll have the left in kind of concentrated in more militant sectors that will do these like militant strikes that will go on and on, sometimes for a long time, exhaust themselves, and will, by being basically isolated from the bulk of the working class. And then basically the ultimate result is the same than with the bureaucracies you'll get in the West.
I want to ask...
in the United States.
Yeah. I want to ask a couple of questions. I'm very ignorant about the French situation, but how did this look back in the day when the situation was different and you didn't have working class on the back foot as you do today. So how does ultra-leftism look in a period where there's more workers on board in joining that militant strike?
Yeah. So in 1995, there was a very militant strike in France, concentrated the rail unions. But basically, they were able to paralyze the whole rail network system. They were there was mass picket lines occupying the railways, the railroads. So basically blocking the trains. And it really basically brought down the government at the time. And that was, one of the recent peaks, if you want, of militancy.
Uh-huh.
And so if you look at kind of more of the struggle that's happened in recent years, you have these big waves of struggle against like pension reforms and so on that have happened over the past few years. But you'll have huge masses of workers that will be mobilized for these one-day strikes, and then other segments that will be mobilized for like a week. So you kind of have a division in that way.
Uh-huh.
And one of the big differences as a consequence is also like all the attention is focused on these big one-day mobilizations, as opposed to what really gave the French strike in 1995 its power, which is, occupying the railroads and actually blocking the rail traffic. So often you'll have these strikes where a lot of the rail traffic will still be functioning nationally. So the point of discussing France is not, it's just an example to show that militancy alone does not lead to victory.
Right.
And whether you're talking about France, where the general level of trade union work is more militant, that doesn't make it more revolutionary or actually more successful much in advancing the fundamental interests of the working class. So whether you're in a situation of very low level of class struggle or low level of militancy or high level of militancy, in both cases, what's really clear is this perspective of having a fundamentally different strategy to that of the bureaucracy and trying to build an opposition to that bureaucracy that can actually take over from it.
Okay. But militancy is good, though.
Militancy is good.
Okay.
But militancy alone doesn't win, because if you have militancy of a small group that's isolated from the mass of the working class, you're not going to win. You're going to be isolated and defeated.
What if you have militancy of a larger group?
Well, it's concrete.
Right.
What are we talking about here?
Right.
If you want to win a partial gain at a specific workplace, and that can be fine. If you're trying to bring down like a government in a big national conflict, then you really need to have a decisive, support of a decisive sector of the working class.
Right. Okay. I want to bring in, look, our experience in working in the union movement in countries from the global south is far more limited. But I want to highlight that the same principles do apply to those countries, that it doesn't somehow just change the situation. I'm thinking of an example just coming off the top, like in India, for example. India is officially on record for having the largest general strike in history, millions and millions of workers, God knows how many. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records, and to somebody who's maybe, less aware of the Indian context, I might be like, oh my God, because they do look, I'll be very honest, they look very impressive, because you do have still in India mass communist parties getting, less mass gradually, but you still have mass communist parties who do have trade unions. They're organized in India. Trade unions are organized along party lines. They're not industrial trade unions. But those guys are pretty effective at bringing out their members and giving them all hammer and sickle flags that can fill, lots of streets, and it looks impressive. But then you get into some of the concrete. So, for instance, India is a country that has a massive and gigantic reserve army of labor. So, in the concrete, how that plays out within the trade union movement is that who's unionized is usually permanent workers, which is an extremely tiny percentage of the overall workforce. Well, first of all, the organized workforce in India is tiny. But then you have a situation where there is so much division within the workforce along all the different lines, including one of which is you are a temporary worker as opposed to a permanent worker. And then how the communist parties, which often control a lot of the unions, how they betray is that they will refuse to organize the unorganized workers, because that goes right up against their own established positions in the workforce. force, because
it's funny you're talking about India, but really you could be talking about almost any country these days, because in so many countries, trade unions are become that, like little islands of
privilege sometimes.
Yes, surrounded by a sea of unorganized work.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting with looking at the global South examples, and I think there's been recent strike in India, I think kind of indicate this, that you very quickly, once some of these lower levels of workers start moving, you really very quickly get into very, very sharp clashes.
Yeah.
And right away, you're not talking about this, negotiated peaceful conflict, but
there's no
real
room for
physical clashes.
There's no room for that in a country. I mean, just what is that? As a result of the Iran war, etc., all this uncertainty, there was pretty significant strikes, I would say, in the industrial belt in the north, in Noida, Gurgaon, in the state called Uttar Pradesh, where, you had this. You had thousands of workers go out on strike, and very quickly they got smashed by the cops, because these are some of the lowest. These are workers who are just demanding extremely basic things, wages, because guess what? It's extremely expensive. But very quickly, demands for some of the most basic things escalates into really clashes with the state forces. And this is a situation where you do really, we've been talking a little bit about you need to have the general perspective in mind in order to do your day-to-day struggles. But in a situation of the third world where you're talking about basic struggles, it really goes up directly against the government. How the government's whole strategy right now is responsible for the huge crisis that's facing the whole population. So you got to have it goes very directly, very quickly into fighting the whole status quo.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, is that the trade union struggle has been such a low level for a long time, and that's in the West, but not just in the West, honestly. That it's there's this kind of almost a lot of the past experience has been forgotten about what does actual trade union struggle really look like. Now, in so many, the eyes of so many people, trade union struggle is just this very routinist, okay, we'll flex our muscles a little bit, the bosses will give a little bit, we'll do but as conditions become harder, that will less and less be the case. And the truth of the matter is the following, is that if you really want to change something important, real concessions from the part of the bosses, it's going to take massive explosions and real, very hard conflicts. And that's something you can really forget if you just don't have a historical or an international perspective. Because even, whether we're talking about India, this massive unorganized workers, or Amazon, or other non-organized sectors, we will need massive battles to organize these, and to really prepare for these. It's necessary to look at the other international examples, but also study history. And that's again where kind of the party can really bring. It has a crucial role to play in terms of kind of bringing this broader historical perspective about where trade union struggles will go in the future and need to go in the future to actually win major victories.
Do you have a specific historical example in mind that you're referring to, or I think
in the United States, for example, the building of the CIO, the industrial unions, and specifically the Minneapolis general strike of the Teamsters, that was really influenced and led by Trotskyist militants, I think have really key lessons to bring about both kind of trade union tactics and strategy, but also the crucial importance of this interrelation between the party and trade union work. But it's really crucial to study such examples, because if you just base your work on the daily experiences you get on the job, you can't really adequately prepare yourself for what's necessary to really win. You need a broader view.
I mean, listeners of the show who listen regularly will know that I don't talk about my workplace or my particular experience. Usually I don't. I might to some degree here and there, but I can't help but start thinking of some of those questions. I think I'd like to speak a little bit about, like, again, especially in this period where we're faced with such a severing of the historical link. Like Thatcher did such. I say this so many times on this podcast, but like, there's really a complete severing in terms of some of the historical memory of the class struggle. So much so that in the country of the 1926 general strike of the miners and so on, the whole concept of a picket line is a very, very foreign thing now, or not, maybe not super foreign, but it's not like, at my workplace they'll say, or even in the labor movement actually more generally, like, to call somebody a scab, you could get into trouble for that because it's impolite, because it's not PC. Like, that's where we are today, and I think that's not unique to Britain. But one of the huge pressures I often feel is that of not shaking the boat so much. Things are at such a low level of struggle. Moreover, in the sector I work in, it's all very like, we're all a big family type of consciousness. The lines are not bosses versus workers, as you would see in a shop floor. But it's more crafty. So it's like, we're all in this together. We're all doing this thing together, And so there's one, the craft consciousness. Two, I think it's more the period where, the sentiment for struggle, for ruffling any feathers that go up against your manager, that's very muted. So one pressure I often feel is one of isolation. And one of like, I think it's more like the right wing conservative pressures. And nobody really wants to stick their head up, partly because nobody else is doing it. So it's a self-reinforcing cycle. But also then there's not really a huge sentiment to do so. There's lots of complaining, but there's not a huge sentiment to struggle. And I find that quite difficult to break out of. Now, let me just paint a bit of a fuller picture. So that's like, on the actual job. And then you'll have the union itself, where the more active layers will tend to come from the left, or, people who were recently animated by the strike waves, but who very much look to the bureaucracy. And then there's a very big difference between the two. And I've seen up close how undemocratic it is, because you can have union AGMs, general meetings, which are attended by maybe 10, 20 people out of, 200, 300, 400 people. And they'll pass motions left, right, and center. And they'll make it look like, oh, well, our union supports Palestine, and our union supports this strike, and our union is like XYZ. But that remains actually quite removed from the day-to-day struggles of the job, the day-to-day existence of the job. You know what I mean? So that, for me, is like where I come from in terms of experiencing some of the pressures of trade union work on my end. And I know in the article you wrote, which I referenced, it's called For Revolutionary Work in the Trade Unions. You go through a number of specific pressures that confront communists or trade union militants who want to shake things up, but have to deal with all the different sort of pitfalls. You've now talked about the French context, ultra-leftism, but I want to talk about some of the other dangers which can come from, for instance, my particular situation, which is more,
Yeah.
not much.
Let me respond to I've got kind of 2 points on what you just said. The first point, and this is a pressure that comes, very often, especially when we're in a period like today where most workers aren't like actively pushing to be more militant. And that point is your influence in the trade union as a militant always has to be based on your actual workforce.
Oh.
Like, especially in a calm period, there can be a lot of pressure to think that, well, okay, most coworkers are hopeless. At least kind of elements of the trade union bureaucracy are trying to do something a little bit, and to kind of really orient towards those layers.
Yeah.
But the problem is that even if you make kind of inroads within the structure of the union, you can kind of climb a little bit. If you're able to do that, without that base of support among coworkers, your position is empty. It's an empty shell. And a lot of the trade union kind of leftist kind of like structures are really at that, empty shells. That means that at the slightest kind of confrontation, they won't have any real strength to confront the bosses other than the strength of the apparatus, which is itself basically and often like tied to the bosses. So you have to build your influence based on the actual workforce.
Yeah.
And that can be frustrating and kind of difficult.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd like to say in terms of what you said is concerns the pressure of feeling that you need to do more, especially as a communist in
constantly
in the working class. You're there, you want to fight for revolution. And here you are, sometimes struggling to even get enough people to attend a union meeting or to even be in a union.
Mm-hmm.
So that can obviously, I see this among a lot of comrades, that you get a sense of frustration, but also of I need to do more. I'm not doing enough.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, to answer that, to me, there's basically two things to look at. The first is you really have to understand the objective conditions like that are going on. Like, as communists, you can't just create a different situation in your workforce just by your presence in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a real limitation to what one individual or even a group of people can do. Like, your role is linked to the course of the class struggle in general. You can't artificially create that situation. And so that's it's something that just needs to be reminded of
constantly.
Constantly.
Yeah. I get told this on a monthly basis. It's true, because it's one thing to understand this on an intellectual level.
Yeah.
And it's another thing to every day wake up, go to work, be confronted with the same crap in your face, and then come home demoralized again and again and again. And then you're like, and then something happens and you're like, oh my God, finally a spark. Maybe I could do something. And then it's like, oh no, you can't. And then sometimes that spark, is quite a bad thing. Yeah. Like somebody really being gone after. And then you're like, okay, well, we need somebody, but then there's no support.
Of course, there can be the other side, which is complacency. Yeah. But to know if you're being complacent or not, just ask you this, like, is there a kind of real sentiment pushing and you're kind of not taking this on?
Yeah.
And honestly, 95% of the time, in my experience, that's not the case. It's not the case of there's this real push at the base and our comrades are like sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
It's overwhelmingly is the other side. Yeah. The other point I want to get to in terms of how to confront this pressure is to really understand where you fit in the broader picture. Where you as an individual trade unionist fit into like the overall course of the class struggle in your country. Like that could sound grand.
Frustrating. Yes.
But you need to look at it that way.
Yeah.
Because you can't just kind of have your horizon be limited to where you work. You have to understand, like, where is the country going? Where's the world going?
Yeah.
And be able to place your specific role into that broader perspective.
Yeah.
And the other side to that is to be able to help the party kind of understand that what you're going through as an individual is extremely relevant for the party.
Yeah.
To be able to orient itself, to understand what's actually happening.
Yeah. All true things. I think these are things which easier said than undone or understood for the comrades actually in the unions, because again, it comes down to concrete pressures.
Everything we're talking about is easier said than done,
Yeah.
Like that's, again, like that comes down to the real difficulty of trade union work, is that you have to be extremely concrete. But at the same time, you need to be guided by these broad principles.
Yeah. The point about you have to understand your place in terms of the broader dynamics of class struggle is an extremely important one, but I think also, for me, oftentimes a very abstract one. And this, again, is where the party comes into play to be able to make sense of those things. But I think for me, actually, if we can talk about this a little bit, is, since the strike wave in Britain, we've been talking about, we had a consistent intervention within the strike wave of how to push this forward. And then when the tide started to turn, we very consciously started to advocate like you need to retreat, but retreat in a way that actually limits the damage that happens to the trade union movement and to its rank and file. And here's to how to retreat, and here's how to rebuild the trade union movement, because that's still very much what's posed on the order of the day. So I think within that context, that's quite helpful in terms, and that's what we mean in terms of, understand the big picture, like where is the direction of travel going? And that has implications for day-to-day work, like, okay, defensive struggles versus are you calling for, let's ballot, let's go for a strike. One of the things I find most frustrating with my union is that, I recently went to a union meeting, the local branch meeting, and it's like, I ask them for advice on any little thing, and I'll be like, okay, yeah, they'll give you like sort of by the book advice on like, here's a policy, here's what we say, here's the rules, la la la, and they'll say, oh, okay, then see if other people feel the same way, and then if they do, then ballot, and then strike. It's like, okay, it's as easy as that. Like my job is just to be constantly like a ballot hamster, and just like go around and like asking people, hey, you want to strike? I cannot imagine something more annoying than that.
And you have the same thing with leftists that are just, oh, there's a problem at work, let's just strike, and that's just the answer to everything. But to go back to the other point, like that's why it's important to be able to understand the context, because, and if we go to the strike wave in Britain or in the United States, there was this strike kind of wave as well, 2022, 2023, I think.
Striketober.
Yeah, that period. So it was very important in that case to be able to put in individual workplaces within this broader movement, because that changes totally like what you can actually win and the momentum that's behind you. So in Britain, the government was in total crisis. There was real momentum behind the unions, and that was really a place where you could push like militancy forward. Now, once the government got resolved and the wave was ebbing, and the strikes were becoming more isolated, then obviously that influences a lot whether if you should still be, calling to escalate and to push for the offensive, or more of a kind of change of posture and more of a defensive. So that's why it's really important to understand this broader sense. And if I can just make a point about kind of where we're going at to where we are today. I think in most countries, like there's a difference. Obviously, I think in the U.S. right now we're seeing like a little uptick in strikes recently, but more generally, what we're seeing is like we're still in this ebb. There was an uptick following the pandemic, but there's now generally we're more in an ebb, and I think the most likely scenario is we're going to be facing some major attacks down the road.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult position right now where we have to be kind of very minimal in many ways, because in terms of like really posing like the most basic defensive actions, but at the same time, kind of always keep in mind that that's not ultimately what's facing us down the road. What's facing us down the road is major explosive battles.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading currently The Third International After Lenin by Trotsky, and in it, obviously, he's talking about the third, fourth, fifth, whatever Congress is, and he's going after, Zinoviev and like the left and the right zigzags and so on. But in doing so, he's trying to it's really a lesson in terms of like, what's a scientific method and how do you lead? How do you understand the dynamics of a given period, and what do you do within that as a vanguard? And, as you were talking, there's a couple of things that I'm thinking of. Like, one, he's talking about defeats. And he says that even defeats educate. And in that education, through that, it strengthens the revolutionary ideas in the working class. Like, there's a defeat and there's a defeat. It depends how you go down, and it depends how you get back up and fight to, how you live to fight another day. And he talks about, okay, your tactics. He's talking about climbing the stairs. I'm just going to read it from this quote. It's he's talking about the right leaven of ultra-left policy. He's saying, quote, on ascending the stairs, a different type of movement is required from that which is needed to descend. Pretty obvious. Most dangerous is a situation as finds a man with the lights out, raising his foot to ascend when the steps before him lead downward. Falls, injuries, and dislocations are then inevitable. So, it really is a question of you need to know the broader picture and the direction of travel, and how's that going to happen? It's everything. It's a totality of everything. You should draw the lessons from what's just happened, what's gone wrong, what do we do now to fight to go forward?
Yeah. there's this call right now for May Day, general strike in the United States.
Ugh.
Like, obviously, that's a case where what is being called for on the left is no relation to what's actually happening in the working class. We're so far away right now at this moment from a general strike in the working class in the United States. The thing why the analogy doesn't exactly work with that of Trotsky is that the left has so little influence that nobody's actually kind of listening. So where it's really dangerous, and that's a point made in the article, is that when it's really dangerous is when the left actually has influence and then pushes a course like that's totally adventurous and totally out of sync of what's actually going on.
But the left, I appreciate you saying that. The left doesn't have that influence right now, but within the left, then to the extent the left has actual working class trade union militants, imagine how confused and disoriented they are, where they might be, I don't know, in an Amazon warehouse or at a school somewhere in the Midwest or whatever have you, trying to go on about a general strike when this is happening. It's incredibly not just like bad in terms of guiding the day-to-day struggle, but it can lead to real demoralization and the destruction of human material, of a cadre, of an actual militant, because there's nothing more difficult than being battered by the day-to-day pressures and feeling isolated and like, oh, well, you're just irrelevant. You've got this huge subjective desire to try and do something, but then you keep getting punched in the face day in, day out. And then being disoriented in that context can lead to real demoralization. So...
No, what's really lacking so much in the left is just a serious approach to trade union work. So much of it is just based on gimmicks and fake kind of, posturing. Or like, but we're so in need of just a serious approach to long-term serious approach to really rebuilding the power of the unions and really putting the working class on a stronger footing and really building real influence in the working class as well, because the workers won't follow like gimmicks and kind of things that look good on social media. They're going to look to people that can actually help advance their struggles, and that's really the goal we need.
And it's a very material question. It's people's livelihoods on the line. For the left, it might be a gimmick. Do I go to uni, or do I go try my hand at being a worker and see how I like it? Or maybe if not, then I can move back into my mom and dad, or go back to, I don't know, get my master's degree. God knows. The left is a bubble. I'm sorry to say that, but it's not a joke for real people. And that is why, that's the first and foremost reason why like the left has to understand a proper approach to doing trade union work, that it has to actually be based on the concretes. It has to intersect where people are at, and it has to show, hi, this is how we actually fight to improve your situation. And that is not just a economic question, not just wages, but overall.
But I think your points are important, because trade union work is really the lives of people. Like you're talking like to launch a strike or not to launch a strike, like this will have very, very real consequences in coworkers' lives, and it could and they could potentially be faced with losing their jobs or worse. So this has to be taken very seriously, like what you say and how you intervene in the working class.
Yeah, for sure. Now, look, we've been talking for like an hour at least. We still haven't actually gotten around to looking at the specific other trends. I mean, I know we talked about ultra left, but I think just for the sake of my own OCDs, opportunism, that's a broader political concept. What is opportunism within the trade unions?
Well, obviously it can express itself in all kinds of different ways, but at the bottom is it's when you're not actually confronting the real obstacles to advancing the struggle. You're just kind of going with the dominant pressures. Generally, is just following the trade union bureaucracy.
Right.
You're not trying to propose an alternative strategy.
Right. Okay. So going with the flow, opportunism.
Basically.
Then left-wing criticism we've talked about, but that's when you're like trying to not go with the flow, but by doing it to...
That's a big trap, It's basically just the trade union bureaucracy says we need a 10% increase of wages, and you say we need a 20% increase of wages.
Right.
You know, and
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, but it's the problem is this is that if your whole basis on which you oppose the trade union bureaucracy is being two steps to the left, you're not actually offering like a fundamentally different strategy based on like a different kind of class standpoint. You're just trying to kind of be a left critic, a left pressure on the bureaucracy.
Okay.
And the problem with this is that when the pressure on the bureaucracy gets really strong, they can be twice as militant than where you stand right now. To me, one of the examples for me is like the anarcho-syndicalists in Montreal that I used to know a little bit. It's like, so they would put on like they would be all leftist and everything, and like criticize the trade union bureaucracy, and then have these calls. But the thing is that the trade union bureaucracy in Quebec can be very, very militant. So you'd easily find yourself in a situation where like the trade union bureaucracy would do like illegal strikes. The basic call of the anarcho-syndicalists is always you have to go against the laws. But then you would get the trade union bureaucracy that would actually do this to a certain extent, of course,
Yeah.
But that would just totally undercut the whole reason for why these anarcho-syndicalists exist.
Right.
So that's the point, is that you have to base yourself not on just like being more leftist, but you really a different strategy. Because the whole question is that, okay, once you challenge the law and you come up against the state, then what do you do? And neither the anarcho-syndicalists nor the trade union bureaucracy have an answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's why you have to have a different strategy and not just be more left-wing than the bureaucracy.
Right. I think we can talk about that for another hour, about what constitutes a different strategy, because often what we see in the left is they will counterpose, say, a longer list of demands that are more to the left, and they'll think that constitutes in and of itself a strategy, but that's not what we mean.
I think very basically I'd summarize it like, are you using the means of the class struggle as fundamental lever to advance the interests of the working class? Are you kind of guided by that? Or are you guided by trying to conciliate the classes, to try to have a good understanding between the classes? That
the class line.
If I had to summarize, it kind of reduces to that.
Okay. Anti-union ultra-leftism. We've spoken about ultra-leftism, but the anti-union version, I mean, the tendency that immediately springs to mind is the Northites.
Yeah, World Socialist website.
Who, the reason why I wanted to get our understanding, not just our understanding, the Marxist understanding of the trade union bureaucracy out of the way, is you can have the same understanding and derive drastically different conclusions from it. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, they're sellouts, you need to fight them. But then the conclusion of the World Socialist website is, okay, well, the trade unions are just sold out, get rid of them. You or workers organize outside of them. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think that is it's not the strongest current these days, and I think even the World Socialist website has kind of moderated some of their positions. But yeah, that's an important danger in the left, is to just view the trade union bureaucracy, start from the correct point of view. Okay, the people running them are kind of pro-capitalist, but then just throw out the whole unions. As opposed to try to fight within the unions for a different course and for a different leadership. And so let's just build our kind of alternative union, or just reject the unions altogether. And that obviously is a disastrous course that, if you do just splinter off a small group of workers into a more militant union, you're isolating yourself. But then also more concretely is that, some of the picket lines I've been in the United States, workers are very hostile to leftists because they think of the Northites.
You're anti-union.
And they immediately think you're anti-union because a lot of workers really correctly hold on and defend their union, even though they might not like the leadership. They'll be extremely hostile to anybody that says, let's smash your union. That really, you're putting yourself then in the camp of the bosses, actually.
Now, this is probably not the exactly appropriate place to talk about this, but one thing I do want to bring into this discussion is the case of sort of the non-mainstream unions. So you'll have unions in definitely the West that organize the most precarious workers who are not seen as like the sold out unions, of the mainstream, like the TUC or the AFL-CIO unions. And they'll organize, the gig workers, the cleaners, immigrant workers, and so on and so forth. What's your take on that?
Well, it kind of goes back to some of the themes we already touched a little bit, in that just being more militant or just being oriented to lower workers that are lower on the rung, like that's not sufficient. You really need a different strategy. So if you're organizing some of the most oppressed workers, like one of the key things is to not be isolated and to have those broader links, because you're talking about workers that are more vulnerable. But sometimes these type of unions will like be very isolated and not have really a strategy to break out of this.
At the same time, I will push back and say that I can see why those unions exist, because the mainstream unions, they refuse to organize. They can organize, and they refuse to organize the most vulnerable who are on zero-hour contracts and blah, 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 blah. So I can see the basis for those unions to exist. Then I think the struggle has to be of how to, I don't know, what is the struggle that we have to wage in those situations?
You have to combine kind of militant tactics to advance those the conditions of those specific workers, with building a broader alliance and a broader movement to reorient the workers' movement as a whole. But if I can just make a bit of a more general point, if the solution for like solving the problem of the trade unions was just to kind of split off and then have a more leftist union, then it would be quite easy to solve. But that's not what's really difficult. What's really difficult for leftists is to really develop like a strategy that's based on a fundamentally different perspective than that of the trade union bureaucracy. That's where it's much more difficult. It's not just a spectrum of left wing and right wing, but really a different class starting point. Are you starting with the understanding that you have to build your union according to the laws of the class struggle, or not? Or the laws of like coexistence with capitalism and the bosses?
It's just to add on to that, you can have trade union secretaries who are all about like workers' rights and workers' struggles. Okay, good. I think for me, one example that comes to mind maybe is Sharon Grant here. But then, all right, she can say those things. But then in the rest of her time, she ends up supporting the Labour government. She ends up supporting the war in Ukraine. She ends up, so while talking left out of one corner of her mouth, the bulk of her role is devoted to lending her credibility and authority to the policies of the government. And that's a way to also drive that wedge. Like, okay, if you say you're for this, well, let's fight against the government. And that's where you'll see the rubber hit the road in terms of the trade union bureaucracy.
And I think that's where you can get what we call in the article the danger of economism, is to kind of just bring everything down to a bread and butter issue. Because sometimes it can be somewhat abstract. Like, what does imperialism have to do with my trade union work or trying to get a better wage in the negotiations? But it's actually really crucial, because those things are not connected. If the West is rearming for war, what they will be able to give in terms of better working conditions will be extremely limited. Those things are connected. I think one of the best examples is really the CIO, the building of the industrial unions in the United States. Like, they were built in movement of very militant strikes. But then what happened? The Second World War happened. And then all of these trade union leaders all got behind the government in its war effort in the Second World War that led to really suppressing workers' wages and really putting their whole kind of weight behind the United States. And that really prepared then the decline, actually, of that industrial and militant power of the unions.
Immediately, as you're talking, I was reminded of the pandemic, where all the trade unions supported the lockdown measures. I think we have situations where I'm thinking of dock workers in the East Coast, where they openly back the war aims of the United States because that's important to their particular sector and whatever.
Yeah.
So
if I can give on an earlier point, like to anybody that wants to know how far left wing a trade union bureaucrat can go, I'd suggest they go listen to speeches by Irvin Jim in South Africa.
yeah,
Who basically
he quotes Lenin.
quotes Lenin, calls himself a revolutionary communist, etc., etc.
Yeah,
But meanwhile, in actual fact,
yeah,
his policy is not actually helping to advance the condition of South African workers and the struggle for Black liberation in general in South Africa. But you can never underestimate how left-wing a trade union bureaucrat can speak.
Yeah, actually appreciate you mentioning South Africa, because our last episode was on Julius Malema, where he's just been sentenced to 5 years in prison, and our comrades doing a united front with other left organizations, they've been building this protest against this and fighting against what Malema has been put under. Malema, by the way, is a leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, a radical Black nationalist party, who's been a thorn in the backside of Trump. Anyways, so one of the main slogan that our comrades have raised in this united front is for the unions to come out and defend Malema, unions including NUMSA, to come out and fight for Malema. Why? And you see, the minute you start to do concrete work, you understand this contradiction. It stops being sort of theoretical mystery or whatever, because, the Black masses in South Africa, national liberation speaks really dearly to them. I mean, there's a country of apartheid and, the anti-apartheid struggle. And the Black liberation speaks dearly to them. But then you have the fact that the trade union tops of NUMSA don't come out and fight against how the leader of this Black nationalist party is being gone after. So that's a way to drive the wedge between the rank and file of that union and its top leadership, which isn't actually doing anything concretely to fight for what their rank and file wants, which is don't go after Malema,
Yeah. In South Africa, you can't separate the struggle for better trade union conditions, better bread and butter conditions, the struggle against imperialism, and the struggle for national liberation. And although that's extremely burning in South Africa, the basic point is true everywhere else. Like whether you're talking about the United States, Britain, France, Germany, India, like you have to connect those broad issues of fighting against imperialism, where the world is going, to the improvement of the material conditions of workers. And that's really why that connection between the Revolutionary Party and trade union work is so fundamental.
I think that brings me to our last point, which is a mini maxi program. There's a whole tradition within the Marxist movement of the minimum program. Like we fight for bread and butter issues today, and then we fight for socialism tomorrow. But I think what you've just said addresses that dichotomy and how it gets presented, which is these are not divorced. You actually have to fight to bring those big picture struggles into the concrete, but do it in a way that actually intersects the consciousness and the questions of the day.
And it really becomes concrete to the extent that you're really trying to push against the course that's put forward by the trade union bureaucracy, and trying to really rally the working class around a fundamentally different strategy for the union. Now that gets posed in very concrete, kind of specific tactical things at given times, but has to be informed by a different strategy, a different outlook.
Okay. So that's quite a long discussion. I do appreciate. I have quite enjoyed it. But to bring it back to May Day and today, for me, again, the reason why I wanted to do this was to discuss some of the lessons of working class struggles, both the defeats and the successes, in order to use them to fight today. So my question to you to start wrapping this discussion up is, how would you summarize what is a Spartacist lesson for our listeners on May Day?
Well, I wish I could summarize our whole discussion in some brilliant phrase, but it's concrete. I think it's very there's not. I think the point with trade union work is that you'll never have a formula that will guard you against, prepare you for every situation. It is such concrete work. You really have to go into the weeds of what's actually going on, what's the actual consciousness. But at the same time, be informed by this broad view, this broad strategy of where you fit in and so on. And that's really, I think that's what makes trade union work difficult. And I think one of the places where Marxists fall on their face so often is because you have to really combine these two elements to be effective.
Yeah.
And if I could just finish by making an appeal, like especially to younger listeners that may be listening to us, and in line with the recent article, one of the recent articles we published in Women and Revolution, I'd really like to appeal to younger comrades who've not necessarily decided what they want to do with their lives yet, to really consider like trying to get industrial skills and try to really join a trade union and do trade union work. It's really one of the best ways to really learn how to become a real communist, and that can actually intervene in the class struggle as a revolutionary factor.
Yeah.
Not just having smart ideas, but really be able to combine the practical and the theoretical work of being a communist. I think there's not a better way to do that than through trade union.
Yeah. If I can just add a couple of things, I think that approach has been quite crucial in our reorientation as an organization of recent years, where that symbiotic relationship between the organization and comrades in the working class has allowed us to do the interventions we've done. And it has also allowed, maybe some listener might have been thinking like, oh, well, there's such a dichotomy here. You got the party people and then you got the workers. Well, that's really not how it is inside the org, where this approach of actually doing trade union work in a Marxist way means that, like, those comrades have really led some of this work. They've become leaders in their own right of such work because it allows them to really understand the dynamics of the class struggle and how to draw that class line in order to fight against those obstacles. And actually, and to do it in a way that speaks to, quote, normal people out there in the world.
Yeah, we really learned a lot through doing this work. How do you actually conduct such interventions, and how do you actually connect with the working class? As opposed to making gigantic leaflets with every point under the sun that nobody will read.
Yeah. Look, there's, again, more to be said on this topic, but if I can, I want to just make a little plug and end with a quote. You mentioned the new WNR, Women in Revolution. In that, I very consciously made a small little package. I mean, the issue is devoted to youth. You've just cited the whole appeal to youth. But within that, there's a really small package on women and industry, women in the working class. And within that, we published an interview with Emily Turnbull, who is recently retired longshore woman out in the West Coast in the Bay Area from ILW Local 10. I encourage listeners to go check out her interview. Hopefully I can have her on the show soon. But I asked her in that interview, she was in longshore for over 20 years. I asked her, what's one piece of advice from your time in longshore working as a communist in the trade union? What is your one piece of advice? And I just want to quote her answer. And she said, whether your union leaders are open supporters of Donald Trump or they trend toward Bernie Sanders' progressivism, they are still the main obstacles. You can't ignore them. You have to work patiently in the unions, mobilizing the membership around its own interests to defeat the bureaucracy in practice. You can never lose sight of that. And I think that in many ways sums up our discussion. So, yeah, we'll leave our listeners with that on this 1st of May. Happy May Day. Happy International Workers' Day. I hope our listeners found that discussion useful. And I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think it made sense to me in my head, but I'd be curious to hear people's views and opinions. And we'll leave it there. I'll link all the different things in the show notes. Thank you very much for your time.
Of course.
And for explaining why you were the guy to do this discussion with. I found it quite instructive. I encourage our listeners to get in touch, give us your feedback, what we can talk about more, what you didn't understand, what you take issue with, and always happy to have a back and forth about differences and disagreements and agreements also. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep in your